Okay. So let's just first pray for the best. I woke up this morning today not really finding my voice. So let's hope that it will bear me through the talk. But I apologize in advance in case my voice should disappear for some reason. But anyway, it's really nice to meet you. My name is Lundahl Seitl, and I am part of the artist duo Lundahl Seitl. My background is in choreography, and Krista's background, Krista's not here, but you can see him still in the image. And his background is in the visual arts. And as you see from the image, we kind of have a lot of ideas, but those ideas are often quite chaotic. And since both of us are neurodiverse in various different ways, we are also sensitive or oversensitive to a lot of sensory input. But this sensitivity is also is something that we actually use as a tool within our work. And hence the title of the talk, which is A Language of What May Not Be Said, which I will go back to and try to share with you as much as I can. We are also working a lot in between disciplines. So we work both in the context of choreography, in theater, in the visual arts, in the cinema, we do virtual reality, music, etc. We are also actually a family, but I promise I will not go too deep into that to add like just extra complexity to everything. But during this talk, I will really try to share with you our methods and how our quite chaotic thinking and sensitive minds are still able to create complex artworks. And I will try to give you an insight into our process, actually, so we're not just going to focus just on the end result. So first, I will try to describe just briefly what we do. So in our work, we're responding to environments such as museums. We respond to theaters, to observatories, or we do respond to abandoned cinemas, or like you see in the image, we respond to disused particle accelerators. And in our work, we both use really high-tech methods as well as really non-technological approaches. So what you see here on the image is one of our most complex pieces called Garden of Ghostflower, together with, in a collaboration with Untold Garden. And what you see in the image that they are trying to feed an invisible life form, a virtual ghost flower, with their voices. And in this work, you can see your own voice, but you can also see the voice of other people in the group, and you're interacting with those voices in real time. And as you hear from it, that's very complicated. But on the other hand, this is our most used non-technological tool. I actually have it with me. We named them whiteout goggles, and it doesn't have any technology in it at all, and it lets through light and shadow. It's almost a little bit like early biological eye, which could only differentiate between light and shadow. And when we were this autumn, we were at the MIT, next to MIT Media Lab. They were actually very impressed with the way in which we programmed these goggles. But then, because they don't have any programming, obviously, in them, but it made us maybe realize, because around the time when we started to use the goggles in 2007, there was no such technology around by then. So I somehow realized that we, in a way, consciously or unconsciously probably, are trying to simulate technology that doesn't yet exist in our work. But don't ask me how, because I don't know the answer yet for that question. But we work a lot with three-dimensional sounds in headphones. We also use smell in our work sometimes. But here is our most consistently used tool, is actually the human hand. And what you see is a performer guiding a visitor. I say a visitor because in our work the term viewer is not always appropriate, because you're not always using your eyes as a vision. And I think this is the heart of our work, and it could in a way be described as a non-verbal relation between the performer's body and the visitor's body. And it's a relation that is partly improvised, but also it has a very complex choreographic score. And a lot is happening in this meeting between two strangers, which I will talk about soon. When we were at the ACT MIT this autumn, we were performing a work called Symphony of a Missing Room. And you can see from the image that there is a performer guiding a visitor. And the visitor are wearing the whiteout goggles and listening to three-dimensional sound. And at the same time, she's also using synchronized touch. She's guiding the visitor in rhythm with a score. And in our work, we're not really telling a story like in an ordinary way. I just have to say this, because the important thing for us is not to overtake the visitor with our story. Instead, we really need to leave some empty space for the visitor, because in a way, we believe that the essence of this work happens within the visitor itself. And I could almost say that the true owner of the artwork is the visitor. Because if the story is too dominant, the visitor will somehow fall out of the equation of the work and can no longer fill that void with their own story or own images. So sometimes we use the term choreographic absences, the viewer or the visitor as a medium. So these inner images felt by the visitors are created by them, and it comes from their own lived memory archive. They might, for example, experience walking through their own recollection of a forest, a cellar, the memory of an attic. And this is what we mean by virtual as an ability rather than a technology. And perhaps it's kind of closer to the way a book works on the imagination. Because as you read a book, you immediately start creating an inner visual landscape as a response. And this is, of course, not something you do before you read the book. You don't map out your imagination prior to reading the book. This is rather an immediate thing that happens. So maybe I would say that in the work Symphony of a Missing Room, we use triggers of sound and touch and movement, but here not only using your visual imagination, but you're also walking through this landscape with an embodied state. And we like to use this friction between the physical reality and the virtual, and including our body. So could we then say that it's a form of inverted virtual reality? So first, when we receive a commission for Symphony of a Missing Room, we spend a lot of time on site because we work very site-specifically. And Symphony is a work that has a lot of different incarnations and versions. It's a flexible form of work that changes every time it comes in contact with spaces, people, culture, and history. So here on the image you see, it's the Argonaut Observatory in Berlin. And it's actually the place where Einstein first presented his relativity theory, which then affected the story of the work. And you can also see that they're touching a meteorite. This is a real meteorite that you can touch at the observatory. And it fell to the Earth 60,000 years ago, but yet it's from the beginnings of the creation of our solar system. It contains iron and some nickel. And in the story, we're referring to that, the iron in your bloodstream, the calcium in your bones. And because also that, if you don't know, that these elements are created within the body of dying stars, so iron, calcium, when a supernova explodes, you get the elements from that. Here we have, we were recording sound to get the bony feeling. They're fish bones, we're working three-dimensional sound. And to get the feeling of the stone, this is how the microphone is on the ground, as you see. And when we come to a new place, we often try to feel how it feels like being in that museum or that site. So here we're just standing with the eyes closed at the V&A. And we are really trying to also talk about it and try to grasp if there is any shared kinesthetic response to that space that could influence the approach of this version of symphony that we are about to create. So, for example, how does the architecture make you feel? Does it make you feel visible, observed, or do you feel like heavy like a stone in this space? And then we work with those sensations, and or we either work with them or we contrast them in the work. So parallel with the process of connecting to the site, we will start building the score and the script of the work. When I say script, it does not necessarily mean the use of words, because even though we use words in the work, It's more used for triggers to trigger various different embodied states of physical sensations and how they run from one state into another. So it's maybe more similar to a score of music where the main instrument are the senses of the visitor's body. For a commission that we did for Casual Stadttheater this year, running alongside Documenta 15, we had the idea that we wanted the visitor to embody a river. And we were working, we were first trying to make the score, as you see on the right-hand side. So we tried to make a river score. And then we invited a choir leader and a composer to work with singers to recreate the sound of the river with voices, which you can see here. And it's also important how the microphone moves, as well as the movement of the singers, in order to get the sense of the flow of the river. So why would you want to embody a river when you enter work? So when we got the reading list sent from the curators of this exhibition, we got a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. It is written by Robin Kimmerer, and she speaks of the native language of Potawatomi. And this is a language where natural objects are described as verbs rather than nouns. So for example, rather than saying a hill, you say to be a hill or to be a tree, because it relates to the hill, tree, or bay. It releases it from its bondage and lets it live. And the language then itself reminds us in every sentence of our kinship with all of the animate world. And I think maybe this nails our approach to immersion and why I believe immersion is important. So in Symphony of a Missing Room, could you then say to be an artwork that the visitor is the artwork itself? Once we start the scripting and the recording, we start rehearsal, and this often happens locally. So we work with guides from many different cultures, and this is also useful because in different cultures there are different customs of how to touch. And during this process of rehearsal, this is when our sensitivity to sensory input becomes more useful, and it's a period of testing our ideas onto a test audience. But before testing, we need to practice a lot. So what you see here on the image is that we're trying to create the illusion of an architecture that doesn't exist. So on the left side, we're trying to create the sense of a small tunnel. The other one, we're trying to create the feeling of a door that doesn't exist, just by the choreography and with the whiteout goggles and the three-dimensional sound. So sometimes when you're inside your museum, you can see the visitors bending down in their own imaginary map of architecture. But sometimes we might also want to give a sense of what is beyond the logical, but can it still yet be experienced kinesthetically? So even though we know that it's impossible, and here we're trying to give the feeling of another presence from above, so as if the guide would be floating above you. And it's not that hard actually, it's just the way you angle the fingers in combination with the sound and the direction of the light of the torch that she's holding that you can see. But then it's also, of course, the importance of the hand. So when you are guiding the visitor, we don't really want you to think of who is guiding you. The hand is rather a force, or it's more maybe an embodiment of an architecture or an embodiment of a room. So here we're trying to practice how it is to lead with a less human, perhaps more abstract way. But quite fast we realized that when people enter the work, we were confronted with their ability to trust. And this was actually not intended at first. But trust is actually not a static state, it's rather a process. It's a fluctuating relationship that unfolds in time. And as a performer, you become very aware of this very important aspect as you intuitively have to respond to the visitor's non-verbal communication. And although the work has a choreographic score, the trust element itself cannot be choreographed or predicted. There is a sociologist called Hartmut Rosa that describes a state of being with the world is to be flexible enough to be transformed by something other than you, yet maintaining your own frequency. But even though we work with this for so many years, I cannot fully say that I know what trust is exactly. You know when it happens and you know when it does not. But I guess there is not like only one answer to this. But how do we then describe a sensation like trust in the body? And how do we describe other kinesthetic sensations that come up during the rehearsals, for example? In order to reach further, we need to, of course, understand each other. How do we even start by naming these sensations when we, in the first place, lack a vocabulary? Because our society is very ocular dominated. If, for example, if you would ask me, how do you feel today? I might, if I would give you a rather honest answer, I might say, well, I do feel very present in my back, and my head feels more connected to the ground rather than the sky. And then you would maybe think, oh, she's strange. So how can we actually not, how can we notice these things if we don't really talk about it and have a vocabulary for it? So I collected the bodily sensations over time, over the years actually. And as I mentioned, I'm neurodiverse, so I'm sensitive to sensory input. So everything that I experience has some kind of physical revibration or sometimes a very specific sensation in the body. And a lot of these sensations then really become part of our choreographic score or our ideas or themes. I realized that I actually haven't shown you how it might look like when the work is being performed, so I will do that.
Listen to my voice. Close your eyes now.
കിടിലൻ എക്സ്പീരിയൻസ് എനിക്ക് ഇവിടെ പിന്നാലെ വന്നതിൽ ഒരു ജേർണി ആയിരുന്നു ശരിക്കും.
It was a beautifully guided virtual reality experience.
ചുറ്റുമുള്ള ഒന്നിനെ നമുക്ക് കണ്ണുകൊണ്ട് നേരിട്ട് കാണാൻ പറ്റില്ല, പക്ഷെ നമുക്കത് അനുഭവിച്ചറിയാൻ പറ്റും. ശരിക്കും ഞാൻ വിചാരിച്ചു ഞാൻ ശരിക്കും റൂമിന് നടുക്കാണ്, അപ്പുറത്തും തട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു, ശരിക്കും തട്ടിയിട്ടു. പക്ഷെ അല്ല, ഫ്രണ്ട്സിൻ്റെ അടുത്ത് പറഞ്ഞപ്പോൾ എവിടെയോ ആയിരുന്നു അത്, അവരാണ് ചെയ്തതെന്ന് മനസ്സിലായത്.
I actually felt that I was not here in this space. You know, I was not here. I was taken away into a completely new dimension.
It's been an amazing experience. I've never had these kind of emotions and sensations kind of aroused. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
What was really beautiful was not only the idea and the execution, but the way it was actually done. It was beautiful because it demanded trust.
So this was at the Kochi Museum's biennial in Kochi, India. And as you saw in the film, the visitors are walking through a water-filled room. They actually did this. And this is actually an installation by the Chilean artist and poet Lundahl Seitl, The Sea of Pain. So the work was site-specifically created for that. But we also use other spaces. So this is in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. And the statues that you see are from the 6th to the 5th century BCE, which requires, I guess, another type of trust, not to bump into those. And by the end of the work, without realizing, the visitors actually left the whole museum behind them. And as they take off the goggles, they see the Parthenon at the Acropolis Hill. You have seen this image before, but I'm just saying that here it happens at the Momentum Biennial, and inside the artist Fukio Nakaya. It's an indoor cloud. I will now go over to our virtual reality work. So it's called Eternal Return, and it's the first VR piece that we did, and I totally fell in love with VR. And I guess we'll always do. It's a collaboration together with ScanLab project, and this is an installation in 3 chapters. It's 3 totally different VR artworks, and you can also see them being performed from the outside perspective. So it started inside a space. It started in Steinway & Sons piano factory. And we spent a lot of time there because in their cellar there were piano tuners working there, and then they had a very focused way of working. We were recording them for a week, and for me it was almost as if they had an invisible sense that was not accessible to most humans. And for me they were almost like invisible makers of time, where the instruments or the pianos were the machines that played out the passage of time. We were sometimes placing the microphones directly inside the piano to make the visitor feel as if they are a piano, or as if they were inside the piano itself. Among the piano tuners, one day we encountered a piano player. Her name is Cassie Yukava, and we heard her play the Bach's Fugue in A minor, and this started to influence the direction of the work. In Bach's Fugue, he uses the musical structure of a canon. So he sometimes inverts the canon and plays it backwards, which creates almost like an infinite loop or a spiral, which makes time seem more non-linear. And the way Cassie was playing the work gave us the kind of intuition how to think around the concept of time within this particular VR artwork. So when you have a linear time passage, you need to be able to leave traces into the past. You cannot leave traces into the future. But in this work, actually, you encounter traces of yourself in the future. So that had a very strong influence. So the pianist Cassie became part of the work too. And together with ScanLab, we scanned her into the virtual world, and we recorded the sound from various different angles. And ScanLab also were scanning the piano tuners workshop, which for us it was almost like a universe where the piano tuners were making time. And I remember kind of thinking about the piano workshop as an entire universe where the objects appear like giant constellations or galaxies. Here's a model of the workshop, and I really love looking at it because it makes me really drawn to the question of what exists outside the model. And I think this is an existential question to us. And I think we're always, me and Christy are always looking for the edges of our reality. So what would happen if we could move outside the model of our own reality? And what would that mean to the passage of time? I actually read this morning in a book called Future Stories that the way we think spatially about time can vary in different cultures, so metaphorically and linguistically. So many Mandarin speakers might think, for example, past as up and future as downwards direction, or behind us like many Aboriginal communities do. So I don't know how that would affect the bodily sensations in relationship to time. But an idea we'd had then would be that what would happen if you fell out of the model in virtual reality, that you fell through the floor and out into the void below the workshop. And we were experimenting with this at ScanLab project. But then as you try to reach back upwards again, you would actually feel that the model would have become solid again and physical, and you can see that on the right-hand side, that a performer is actually putting this material in front, so they experience as if they're below the floor. So in this way, we were blurring the boundary between the physical and the virtual by contradicting them, not in space, but rather folded out in time. But there are more contradictions in this work, and this is reflected in the objects that are being made. So we are actually rather interested in the glitches between the physical and the virtual. So it's not necessarily that we're out for the full immersion. So what you see here is part of the piano tuner's working bench. And we scan that part, you see in the corner down, you see the hammer. So when you see that in VR, we also printed out the object, but the hammer that you see visually is being inverted, like an absence, like a missing space, so that you can feel at the same time as you see it in VR. Here you can see someone, a visitor, touching the piano tuner's working bench. But in the work, we also use several different objects, and one very important object that is different from the others is the one that you see on the left, top left here. And this is a stromatolite. It's actually a fossil, and it's got traces from cyanobacteria, which were responsible for creating the oxygen of our atmosphere. So for me, it's almost like one of the Earth's first photographs. The memories in it are being imprinted. And at one point in this work, the visitor can actually touch this object and feel its traces, and feel kind of the traces of time, non-linear time, I guess, with their fingers. I will now show you how it sounds like in the work when they're touching the stromatolite.
With the event of biological life, memory happens. Here. Reach out your hand as if you're about to receive an object.
Reach out your hand.
Careful. If you drop it, you'll take a second to break. But it took 3.5 billion years to form.
And for me, I guess this whole work feels a bit like being inside a virtual fossil, where each object that you encounter is connected to some kind of memory. So when you come close to one of these objects that you see, they unfold and spiral out into a room. And I will now show you kind of how the memory archive in the VR piece looks like.
Listen. You brought back the memory of the space.
So during the rehearsals, we also realized that, do you remember the guiding hand of Symphony of a Missing Room? This hand did no longer work in virtual reality as much as it did before. So we needed some other kind of manifestation of the guide in the work. And so then one of our collaborators had a brilliant idea of using a tracker, and this tracker would be a representation of the guide or the performer in the work. We didn't want a human presentation. It's rather like a cluster of points. So when you move the tracker on the stick that you see, it's a live element inside the work. And I will show you a little bit how that looks like. This is the performer's presence inside the work.
Things might happen with no one there to remember it.
Yes, so just very shortly to show you. And also this opened up a lot of different possibilities for the performers to exist physically in the work. So I will show you how the performer operates in this next film. Okay, so far I've been talking about works that are run by a performer, but actually most of our works are run by the visitors themselves. And I only have time to talk about one of these works. Or well, it's rather a laboratory. It's an ongoing project. And it's performed by the visitors themselves. It's called Garden of Ghost Flowers, and it's a collaboration together with Untold Garden. So in this work, you're using your voice in order to feed an invisible virtual flower, a ghost flower, and it needs the voice of the group to survive and to evolve. So the group, you can see your own voice, and you can see the voice of other people, but you never really see the virtual being of the ghost flower, because rather than having the ghost flower as an external entity which you look at, it's more about that you see from its perspective, because what the flower needs, it lives off your voices. So therefore, you see only what the flower needs. You don't see your body, you don't see the bodies of other people, you only see the voices. And then depending on how you use your voice, this gives like different potentials to the visuals. We were working together with a voice, or we are working together with a voice therapist that were kind of teaching us different places where the voice can come from. And because this is kind of in a way, we are trying to understand the food for the virtual ghost flower, which is the voice. And I think like when you're inside the work, it's almost, for me, looks like, or inside the lab, I should say, like I would see a voice in the dark, like a little erupting volcano. It becomes almost more like an abstract landscape. This work is then inspired by a ghost flower, and ghost flowers are real. They are biological ghost flowers. And they're very special because they don't photosynthesize. They can survive in total darkness. So they don't need the sun in order to survive. But it lives off the sugars in the mycelium web. So it's seen as the hacker of the wood wide web. And it's a little bit seen as a parasite. But it's not completely proven yet if it really doesn't give anything back, but it inspired the work in a way that it has a more trickster-like character in the work. So it needs the voice of the group in order to evolve. And I might also kind of tell you later what the group might receive back. But the first thing that the groups needs to do when they enter the place where the virtual ghost flower lives, the biosphere, is to wake it up from its virtual hibernation state with the help of your voices carefully. And before you wake it up, even there's nothing within your headset, nothing. It's just dark, black. And it takes some time to wake it up, but you know that you're waking it up when you start to see your voice and the voice of others. Because the voice is what the flower really needs. So you don't, as I mentioned before, you don't need to see it as an external being. And when you start the work, it's all in darkness, but because the biological ghost flower, when it's deprived of nutrients, it turns black instead of white. So that's why we start in black. But eventually, as you give it more energy, you realize that you start to see the other people in the room. And suddenly it goes into a whiteout. So all the people disappear instead into a whiteout instead of a blackout. And then the visuals of the voices become inverted. During this long, probably lifelong process, Christer here is trying to understand and make sense of the life cycle of the voice inside the biosphere. So how long does your voice survive, like if you use it? How does it fall down into silence? And how does it behave in relationship to other voices? And what happens when it meets other voices, and how does it behave in relationship to you? So we needed, in a way, some rules at play. What are the rules in this lab? And then we found, I think I mentioned before, but the sociologist Hartmut Rosa mentions something called resonance, which means to listening, caring, and adapting rather than calculating, commanding, and controlling. That's resonance. So what if it's not only about the voices, but it's the resonant relationship between the voices that actually feeds the flower? So if you're in resonance with the group, then the flower will survive. but it's very difficult, of course, so how can you get the system first understand what resonance is? And I think it's also say something important about our work, because it's an intangible thing. You remember, like we spoke about trust. I think resonance is also intangible as trust is. We cannot really grasp it. Then how can we really program it? So we might do it in the future, but not saying it's impossible. But at the moment, the system reacts more if you're close to someone, and if you keep your voice going, if the volume is not too high or not too low, like that. So I don't have any kind of direct answers. But then, so this is more how it looks like when you're close to someone at the moment. So if you're really close to someone else's voice, you might start to see this. So you see on the left image, the tiny dots are voices from different directions. And after some time, you start to see connections. And then these, if you keep the voices going, membrane-like creatures are starting to evolve there. And I mean, I don't know what they are yet, actually. This is not a ghost flower. This is something else that is living. It's like a further evolution of your voice. And if there are too few voices in the room, you would never see them anyway. And on the contrary, if the group is too loud, it literally, at least at the moment, crashes the whole computer. So we have to restart everything. But for the future, we might kind of bring the group into a different state if that kind of overburns. So how does it feel like to be there? I think I felt when we're trying it, it's almost like it makes me think of a life, an early life form. You know how life was first formed with molecules and polymers that try to stabilize, and then they couldn't because most of the time they would just pop. So it feels like some kind of life that cannot really survive for long, and it's not stable enough. So because we had so many unresolved questions, as I said, this is an ongoing lab. And in living investigation, basically, how human voices can coexist. And this is the biosphere again, how the place that holds the flower looks like. And just to, I promised you to come back to what might the virtual flower give back to the group. And that is actually more, I think, the potential of it is that what if the system could really recognize resonance? Then maybe what the virtual flower can give back in return as a symbiotic relationship is the understanding of learning the group what a resonant relationship is. So that's kind of the intention, I think, for the future. I will show you something soon. This is when we were in early exploration days at Magasin 3. And we were here testing the work first without any technology, together with a choir leader, just working with the voice, and then we did it with the technology. So I will just very shortly show you how it could sound like when we did that. And because they had training before they did it, it wouldn't have sounded so good otherwise. So because you're kind of training the food for the flower, so that might be part of the work in the future. But a thing that often comes up for the visitors is the existential aspect of the work. And a lot of people describe states of fluctuating existence between different realities, between life and death, trust and distrust, the physical and the virtual. For example, in the Ghost Flower Lab, if the group creates a lot of these life forms with their voices, the ghost flower might indeed be overfed, but will also eventually overpower the group. So I guess the price you pay for producing too much voice is to be left behind. So at the end, we want the group to lie down and then watch the continuous life of their voices if they created something. So how do you come to terms with that question, actually? Like what the feeling of being left behind. And this again makes me think of the cyanobacteria, which I mentioned, because they actually almost died from their own waste product, which was oxygen. And I guess they couldn't understand fully, of course, that what they created would lead into other living organisms' continuation of life. So we're coming towards an end, but before I leave you, I would just like to explain again why I insist on the importance of the body. So perhaps the simplicity of embodied experience is what we share with other non-human living organisms. Because even bacteria has some sense of basic sensing, for example, balance. According to the philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith, who wrote the book Other Minds, if you haven't read it, he means that sensing is not only present in animals, but also in cellular life. And he says, we must continually avoid into the habit that all experiences must be human. Therefore, the expression of, now I'm talking, to be a tree or to be a flower might no longer feel that far away. And then I guess sometimes I feel that there is a beauty too in understanding the diversity of the human mind too, because we might be more varied than we think as well. Okay, running a little bit late. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me.